Good evening. I'm Nima and this is Forum Daily for Wednesday, February 15th. We start the newscast tonight with a new report highlighting a drop in home sales across the country last month. Home sales in Canada plunged 37.1% year over year in January. The Canadian Real Estate Association says last month's sales were the lowest for the month since 2009. Home sales tumbled last year as rising mortgage rates increased the cost of borrowing and slowed the housing market. CREA says the actual national average home price fell 18.3% year over year to slightly more than $612,000. Well, after days of shooting down unidentified objects in Canada and the U.S., we've learned of a new airspace interception on Monday night. This was when North American fighter jets scrambled to intercept 4 Russian military aircraft. The North American Aerospace Defense Command revealed yesterday that it detected a group of Russian long-range bombers and fighter escorts approaching Alaska. But it paints the incident as one that did not pose any threat. NORAD also dismissed any relation to the string of suspected balloons that U.S. jets shot down off northern Alaska, central Yukon, and Lake Huron. The search for wreckage from those objects continues. Well, amid a worsening crisis in Haiti, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is expected to arrive in the Bahamas today. Now, this is where he will be a special guest at the Caribbean Community Leaders Summit. A group of 20 Caribbean lawmakers are gathering to discuss regional issues, including the deepening political, security, and humanitarian crisis in Haiti. Haiti's unelected Prime Minister, Ariel Henry, has asked for a foreign military intervention to aid in the response to violent gang activity, and the U.S. has suggested that Canada lead one. Shifting gears to immigration in Canada, the federal government has said it wants to boost immigration by adding 1.45 million permanent residents over the next 3 years, starting with 465,000 this year. But data from Statistics Canada shows the percentage of permanent residents who become Canadian citizens has plummeted by 40% over the past 20 years. The nonprofit Institute for Canadian Citizenship says that figure is alarming, and it should serve as a wake-up call to the government about the need to improve the experience newcomers have, especially when it comes to dealing with the cost of living and finding a job. As discussions about the new healthcare deal continue, Yukon's premier says federal healthcare money specifically for the territories is critical to service delivery. Premier Ranj Pillai says healthcare can cost 3 to 4 times as much in the territory. Now, this is where people often have to travel to places like BC or Alberta to get care. Earlier this week, Canada's premiers agreed to a deal with the federal government that will add $46.2 billion in new healthcare funding over 10 years. It includes $150 million over 5 years for the Territorial Health Investment Fund to help cover medical travel and the cost of delivering healthcare in the territories. Moving to Nova Scotia now, where a record 133,500 people don't have a family doctor or nurse practitioner as of the 1st of this month. Now, that's up from 86,000 at the same time last year. Health Minister Michelle Thompson says 27,000 people signed up for the primary care registry in the last year because they are new to the province. Meanwhile, Toronto police have arrested and charged 3 teenagers in Sunday's attack at a subway station. Police were called to the TTC's Spadina subway station after a woman was allegedly involved in a verbal dispute with 3 strangers, one of whom spat in her face, pushed her, and then slashed her face with a knife. All 3 suspects fled, and police say the trio was arrested after a separate investigation on Monday in which a boy allegedly swung a machete at an officer. The Russian invasion of Ukraine has put the spotlight on Saskatchewan and its resources, according to the president of fertilizer giant Nutrien. The ongoing war has caused disruptions in the agriculture and fertilizer sectors. Ukraine is a leader in wheat and oilseed exports, and Russia is a major exporter of fertilizer. Ken Seitz says that the Saskatoon-based company is working to help fill the gap. A volunteer search team that self-deployed to Turkey's earthquake zone last week has returned to Vancouver. A large group from Vancouver's Turkish community clapped and shouted thank you yesterday. This as the 10-person Burnaby Urban Search and Rescue Team arrived home on a flight from Istanbul. Team leader Norm MacLeod is a deputy chief with the White Rock Fire Department, and he said he was surprised by the scale of the devastation in Turkey. Stay with us. We'll be right back after a short break. Advocates are sounding the alarm over the shortage of medical personnel and its impact on sexual assault victims. Acute shortages of specially trained forensic nurses are preventing victims access to timely care, support, and justice. According to Sheila Early, president of the Canadian Forensic Nurses Association, timely care from a sexual assault nurse examiner can help stave off a cascade of post-traumatic effects, including depression, anxiety, and even suicide. These nurses are also responsible for gathering evidence from a victim. Now, this comes as the number of reported sexual assaults in the country continues to rise. Well, joining us now to give us more insight into this is Ms. Sheila Early herself. Ma'am, welcome to Forum Daily.
Thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here.
Now, we spoke a little bit about this in our intro, but for our viewers that may not be familiar, can you go over the role of forensic nurses in Canada, especially when it comes to sexual assault victims?
Okay, forensic nursing is actually a large umbrella which holds many roles, including legal nurse consultants, forensic psychiatric nurses, correctional nurses, forensic nurse examiners across the lifespan. And I will focus on the sexual assault nurse examiner because that's the role that's in the news right now. The sexual assault nurse examiner or the forensic nurse examiner, they're equal terms, is a nurse who is specially trained to care for individuals who have been subjected to violence and trauma in a positive, trauma-related, patient-centered, skilled way, which means that they perform a medical examination, and if the patient consents, of what is known as a medical forensic examination, where they may collect evidence, but they may also just document. Not every case has injuries as we know it. And the importance is knowing the psychological, the physical, and the emotional effects of what is known as a life altering experience, which is what a trauma related to sexual violence is.
And for some further perspective, can you give us a picture of how sexual assault cases are being handled in Canada due to this personnel shortage? We're hearing about some victims being turned away from hospitals because of this shortage. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Okay, it's just to go back a quick history is that the first nurse examiner program was actually in Winnipeg, Manitoba, which is actually in the news right now. And the second one was in Surrey, British Columbia, which I co-founded. Over that 30 years, it was set up as a casual position because the need was at a certain level. That has moved exponentially. We now have many more cases being reported. Now, there's two reasons. One is that the population has increased. The second is more individuals are becoming aware that they can report for specialized care or simply get better medical care. Remember that medical interventions always come first over forensics. The justice system has found over the years that when the meticulous documentation of injuries and findings and the collection of evidence in a way that it can be used by a forensic lab done by forensic nurse examiners or sexual assault nurses has become critical in the criminal justice system. But forensic nurses are trained first to care for that individual medically. When you look at what we call the sequelae of sexual violence, it's a whole page long in the textbooks. So it could go from simply having headaches and nightmares and fear of being alone to, physical, such as strangulation can cause strokes. And that's another area that forensic nurses are involved with now because the evidence has shown that during an altercation, either in intimate partner violence or during the commission of a sexual assault, strangulation often happens and it has not been looked at medically. Psychologically, it can, again, as I mentioned before on newspaper articles, it could be simply somebody being very depressed, having to leave their job, not being able to tell the people that they would normally tell because of fear, because of shame, and also because they don't know that where the support's going to be. Uh, Post-traumatic stress is probably the most highlighted negative effect of any kind of trauma and violence. And that can lead to lifelong disabilities, both psychologically and emotionally. Yes, the statistics do say that individuals undergoing trauma can go to suicide. That's why such things as doing a suicide precaution list before they're discharged from hospital, that would also help. When they're alone, they have no supports. What do they turn inward? They turn inward.
Home sales in Canada plunged 37.1% year over year in January, which is the lowest level for the month since 2009. Now, this is according to newly released numbers by the Canadian Real Estate Association. Home sales tumbled last year as rising mortgage rates increased the cost of borrowing and slowed the housing market. CREA says the actual national average home price fell 18.3% year over year to slightly more than $612,000. Well, joining us now to give us more insight into this and the Canadian housing market is Mr. Shaun Cathcart, Senior Economist at CREA. Sir, welcome to Forum Daily.
Thanks for the invite.
Now, this is the lowest number of sales we've seen since January 2009, as we mentioned, which was just around the financial crisis or Great Recession. So should we be concerned by this? Do you see some sort of connection here?
Not really. I mean, it's one of those stats that sounds worse than it is. It's the lowest since, to your point, the financial crisis. But the January 2023 sales number doesn't look anything like January 2009. It looks a lot like January 2010 to 2019. It's just a little bit lower. So technically it's a 14-year low, but really we're sort of trending around a little bit below average right now. We're not in crisis mode.
All right, sir. So can this drop in sales be seen evenly countrywide, or are certain regions seeing this drop in sales more than others?
It's definitely regional, but it's not about the region. It's about how expensive those markets are. So BC, Ontario are getting hit the hardest, as always happens when there's any kind of policy change that makes it harder to borrow money. The prairies and the Maritimes, East Coast, I should say, because Newfoundland and Labrador is doing pretty well as well, are currently above average. Quebec, somewhere in between those two extremes.
All right. And from a homeowner's perspective, how are the current interest rates impacting the affordability of their mortgages, especially for those looking to renew their mortgages this year?
So that's a big concern. Obviously, it's really slammed people with variable rates in the last sort of year. I don't think we'd ever heard the term trigger rate or even thought that was even possible when you're signing a mortgage covenant up until this last year. But it is possible, and for people that are, with housing, it's all about timing, right? A big part of getting into the market is when you're born. The earlier the better, usually. And with mortgage rates, the way that rates work in Canada versus, say, the US, it's about when it's up for renewal. And certainly mortgages are renewed every day. And I think there's a lot of people that are having to make some tough choices or sort of dreading that. So the big picture there is, how fast can the Bank of Canada tame inflation and get those rates back down to more sort of what they would call neutral levels and get out of inflation fighting mode? Because you're right, it's not a great time to be renewing your mortgage.
Yeah, we're all holding our breath for that. Now, just about 2 minutes left here. I want to jump to a recent report by Oxford Economics. Now, it predicts that Canadian home prices could drop by 30% or more by the middle of 2023. Is that in line with the predictions at CREA?
It's not. And, based on what's been already going on, it would basically have to turn and fall off a cliff starting yesterday for that to come true. So it's a sort of a tail prediction. It's not very conservative, I wouldn't say. It's certainly gets attention, though. We're looking at things sort of stabilizing. I think there's already been a sort of a canary in the coal. I mean, in the prairies, a lot of prairie markets have been stable this whole time, actually. And we're seeing now on the East Coast, in the Maritimes, prices have already hit bottom and are trending back up. So it might take a little bit longer for Toronto, Vancouver. I think probably the worst of this is already in the rear view, and that's about 15% from peak to now nationally. And so less than that in most places, a little bit more in Ontario, but 30% for the whole country. You'd have to have things worsen considerably starting right now, and I don't see that happening with the Bank of Canada basically done with tightening.
All right, sir, just about 30 seconds left here, but what are you keeping your eyes on this turbulent housing market for 2023?
What happens when spring listings come out? Because listings are at a 22-year low right now. You can't buy what's not for sale. So our buyers going to jump on these, and is the market going to recover the same way it did in 2019 after the stress test year? And also inflation. If that gets under control, then we could have a lot more friendly interest rates by next year. But it all comes down to inflation.
All right, sir. Thank you again for your time today on Forum Daily.
My pleasure.
Stay with us. We'll be right back. And coming up next, we're going to take a look at the major news stories and headlines from around the world, of course. So stay tuned. Forum Daily will return shortly. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg says we live in a more dangerous world. He is urging Canada and the rest of the military alliance's members to make good on a commitment to spend at least 2% of their GDP on defense. Back in 2014, NATO allies agreed to move towards spending that amount on their defense budgets by 2024. Mr. Stoltenberg says the need to live up to that commitment is even more urgent now because we live in a more dangerous world. 13 NATO countries, including Canada, spend around 1.5% or less. Meanwhile, the European Union's 27 member countries are looking at imposing new sanctions against Russia. This comes as countries like Iran are supplying drones and other military equipment for Moscow's war against Ukraine. The proposed sanctions would target 7 Iranian entities to try to prevent Russia from using Iranian drones to hit Ukrainian civilian infrastructure. Turning our attention to Paris now, which is the first stop of a week-long tour of Europe for China's top diplomat. The tour comes after the American downing of a suspected Chinese spy balloon. Wang Yi met with French President Emmanuel Macron at the Élysée Palace behind closed doors on Wednesday. He will also travel to Italy, Hungary, Russia, and Germany. Beijing's refusal to condemn the invasion of Ukraine and join others in imposing sanctions on Russia has further fueled a divide with much of Europe. Tragedy in New Zealand, where the Prime Minister says a cyclone has left a devastating wake of extensive flooding and landslides and has claimed at least 4 lives. Chris Hipkins adds that police have grave concerns for many other residents who remain unaccounted for. Cyclone Gabrielle struck the country's north on Monday. Among the 4 confirmed storm deaths was a child caught in rising water on Hawke's Bay. A weather station there recorded 3 times more rain Monday night than usual for the entire month of February. Moving to the UK now, where the inflation rate fell for a 3rd consecutive month in January. It is boosting optimism that the cost of living crisis has peaked and prices will fall sharply later this year. The Office for National Statistics says inflation eased to 10.1% in the 12 months through January from 10.5% a month earlier. The Consumer Prices Index peaked at 11.1% in October. The Bank of England forecasts that prices will fall rapidly in the second half of this year as energy costs begin to moderate and price increases drop out of inflation calculations. Taking a look at retail sales south of our border, which jumped by 3% in the U.S. in January. Spending at stores and restaurants increased at the fastest pace in almost 2 years. This underscores the economy's resilience in the face of higher prices and multiple interest rate hikes by the Federal Reserve. A jump in car sales as well as healthy spending at restaurants, electronics stores, and furniture outlets powered the increase. Back in Europe, Scotland's First Minister is stepping down after more than 8 years in office. Nicola Sturgeon has been criticized for her aggressive push to expand transgender rights and for her strategy for achieving independence from the United Kingdom. But she says her decision to resign isn't a response to the latest period of pressure. Her announcement caught political observers and even members of her own Scottish National Party by surprise. Shifting gears to a new Gallup poll that suggests Americans' level of trust in the media has hit a new low. 50% of Americans surveyed believe national news organizations intend to mislead, misinform, or persuade people to adopt a particular point of view through their reporting. Gallup found 58% of those surveyed get their news online, 31% on television, 7% on the radio, and 3% via printed newspapers or magazines. Researchers are sounding the alarm over what they say is the warming of the waters in the Gulf of Maine. They say the Gulf waters, which touch Maine, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and Canada, are warming faster than most of the world's oceans. The area of the Atlantic, which is home to the critically endangered North Atlantic right whale, posted its second warmest year on record in 2022. The Gulf of Maine Research Institute says certain species are being threatened by disruptions in their food supply due to these warming waters. Six-time NBA champion Michael Jordan is celebrating his 60th birthday on Friday by making a $10 million donation to the Make-A-Wish Foundation. It is the largest donation ever received from an individual in the organization's 43-year history. Jordan hopes his decision to celebrate his birthday by donating to Make-A-Wish will inspire others to help fulfill the desires of the kids still waiting for their wishes to come true. That'll do it for your look at national and international news. Take care, Canada.